This is the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. Hello everyone, welcome to the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. I am your host, Angelica Celinska, and I'm joined today by Helen Battelley. Hi Helen, thank you very much for joining me.
Hi, thank you for inviting me.
And Helen, you have got lots of different roles. So the main role is you're a consultant in education and movement, but you also are an author, a lecturer, and a speaker. So you do lots of things in education and early childhood and surrounding movement and physical development. So a term that you've coined is super scribers. So I thought it would be great to start with that, as today we're discussing movement in early childhood. So it would be brilliant for you to give us some insight of what you mean by super scribers.
Okay, super scribers is a phrase that I coined as part of my research for the Centre for Research in Early Childhood, and it's subsequent courses that I've run both online and face-to-face, looking at supporting educators and parents in how to best support your children or their children in developing mark making and early writing skills. We've seen a lot of educators struggling with children not reaching the expected levels of development in fine motor skills over the years, and COVID has obviously played a huge part in that, along with quite a few other things. But so subsequently, it's good to look at why and how we can best support those children to become super scribers, good writers.
Mm-hmm. And I think a term that you mentioned at the beginning is early writing, and that is something that is not necessarily used enough, I believe, in early childhood, because a lot of the time we talk about writing or drawing, but actually what children see as their own writing may be different marks that they make. It may be kind of mark making to adults or drawing, but children see that as their own writing, even though it doesn't necessarily represent the kind of writing we as adults do. And that is something that I've kind of looked into when I did my own research as part of my master's quite a few years back now. So I just wondered, is the term early writing something that you try and use more, especially when talking to parents, I guess, or do you still use the term drawing, mark making perhaps? What's kind of like the preference, or what would you recommend for educators to use perhaps?
I think mark making and early writing, the problem with early childhood is that we have to really try and keep the focus away from age development and look at stage of development, because children progress at such a different rate. So if you think about a 3-year-old who's born in August to one who's born in September, they will have a third of life's experiences different to the other child because they've spent a year longer. So we have these children starting nursery and reception with practically a quarter or maybe even a third of their life's differences and experiences. So of course you're going to see differences. Of course there's going to be a difference in experiences and interactions and environments that these children have had. So I think it's really important. I know as a parent, I struggled a lot with that with my children. I had a September born and then an earlier in the year born. And I really struggled with feeling that pressure of, is my child's, catching up? Are they in the same place as those other children in the year? And I think we have to be really conscious of that. Most children will catch up in their own time. And in early childhood, we need to make sure that everything is developmentally appropriate and meet every child where they are and help them progress within that sort of period of their own growth. Vygotsky calls it that zone of proximal development. So finding that zone and then helping support and develop them through that. So I think that's something that I would certainly recommend both for educators and parents, to not focus on, this is what we're doing 4-year-olds work now. Actually, teach each child where they are.
So in terms of like practicalities, what would you say to parents or family members who are really worried about their child not being able to write, perhaps just before they go to school or once they've started school, and they as parents believe or feel or can see other children at a similar age perhaps writing their name, beginning to write their name, or maybe confidently doing so, and their child may not be at that stage, and they're kind of having a bit of that panic of like, my child can't write their name yet. Kind of in practical ways, what would you recommend doing?
First thing to do is to make sure that they have lots of gross motor movement. So making sure that they are as physically active as possible. The muscles, our muscles develop in what's called the snowflake effect. So that's from the inside out and from the top down. And we have what's called our proximal stability. So that's everything within our torso, and then our distal stability is our extremities. Now the muscles transcend, so they pass and transfer the muscles onto the lower muscles within the distal stability. So we need to make sure, if we've got these children to hold pencils, and we need, within our hand, we have 60 combined muscles that work cohesively to be able to grip and hold on to a tool for mark making. So in order for that to happen, we need to transcend those muscles from the core, from the upper body, down the shoulder girdle, down to the arm, to allow that rotation of the wrist to strengthen those muscles in the hand. So it has to come from the core. Now, if your child isn't physically able and they're just focusing on that mark making within the muscles, as their hand develops and their hand grows and the bone structure of their hand changes and consolidates as they get older. So for girls, I think it's normally around 4 to 4.5. For boys, it can be as late as 5.5. Then we need to make sure that the tools that they're using are developmentally appropriate. So first of all, gross motor movement. Get them moving as much as possible. Make sure there's lots of core strength. Make sure they're moving on different levels, lots of floor work, lots of climbing, lots of hanging, lots of swinging, lots of twisting, lots of turning, as much movement as possible. The second one is a variety of tools. So giving them various things to mark make with. Lots of different chunky pens, chalks, crayons, squeezy bottles with water that they can squash and then mark make with the water. Giving them just a wide variety of tools to start encouraging that mark making. Also encouraging them in various different environments to get them doing it outside, get them perhaps pop some wallpaper on the walls, get them mark making on the walls, get them mark making on the floor. Encourage them outside to use sticks in dirt, various different ways to encourage that mark making, and making sure we use both hands in early childhood as well is really good before, as they'll start to develop their dominant side. So making sure we're using both initially is really important. And then the other thing which is really important is to make sure that you, as an educator or a parent, are mark making and writing too. Children imitate us. So if we're telling them to write, but they only ever see us on our laptops or on our phones, then actually they might question, why is it so important that I write? So let them see you writing a shopping list. Let them see you writing birthday cards and messages to each other. And I think that's really a really valid point to consider within this.
That's a really good point, actually. We, as adults, actually don't really use pens and paper anymore very much. So it is something that isn't very common, and children don't see it as much. Do you think that is something that will change quite drastically? I know in schools, obviously, there's a lot of writing and mark making and drawing still, and in early childhood settings. However, at home and in workplaces, that's really dying out, isn't it? The kind of the pen and paper.
Yeah, it is, absolutely. Although I have a paper diary, I have lists. I'm a list person. I love my lists. But interesting you say that. I do lots of work with international schools as well as working here in the UK. And I work with a group of schools. They're quite a new, innovative group of schools in China, and they no longer teach handwriting. It's quite a controversial subject, actually. I do often mention this within my training to see how people feel. So they teach the construction of phonics, and they teach the construction of sentences and letters and creative writing. But that's all through digital technology. And instead of teaching handwriting and tracing and cursive writing, they teach sewing, they teach art, painting, and they use that time to invest in other fine motor skills but not handwriting, because their philosophy is that actually everybody's going to have a phone, everyone's going to have an iPad, everyone's going to have a laptop. And when you go to university, very little is written down on paper. It tends to.
Yeah, definitely.
So actually, it's quite a controversial subject, and some people feel really strongly about it either way. But it's interesting.
Yeah, I guess it actually does make sense not to be teaching children handwriting anymore, like we said, in terms of writing dying out. But in terms of the fine motor skills, that's still important in order to be able to handle different kind of materials and resources, and be able to do a lot of other things with your hands, like using different tools and things like that. So I guess supporting children's fine motor skills is always really vital anyway, even if they're not going to be focused on the handwriting side of things.
Yeah. I'm torn because I'm somebody that loves to receive a handwritten letter, and I love to write. And I love the kind of kinesthetic. I'm a bit of a kinesthetic learner in that way, that I love to write things down. And when I was doing my research, there was lots of sort of diagrams and spider graphs and things. But yeah, I see my children who are in their 20s who I don't think ever pick up a pencil, or a pen. So it's an interesting dynamic, isn't it?
Yeah. And so I'm just thinking about self-care, I guess. So in terms of fine motor skills, that's where that really comes in. It's important for children to be able to do up their zips and buttons and things like that. So even if we're not necessarily focused on writing, then at least we can focus on children's independence, and that can be kind of the primary focus around why we should support children's physical development, especially those fine motor skills.
Absolutely. Well, obviously self-care used to be part of physical development in the framework, but isn't anymore. But yeah, it's certainly something that's really important for children to work on their fine motor skills. But gross motor must come first.
Yeah, and so going back to what you were saying earlier, that's really interesting, I think, to a lot of parents and probably educators as well to hear, because when we think about handwriting, we often think about those fine motor skills, and using the fingers and the hand, but it is not as well known, I guess, that the gross motor skills, those big muscle movements, need to be developed first. And it almost seems a little bit kind of counterintuitive to go all the way back to that. But I guess that is the problem. If we don't support children's gross motor skills early, then we do almost have to kind of go backwards and start at those gross motor skills before we can then hone into the fine motor.
Absolutely. And some of the problems that we're incurring as a nation is something called containerisation. I don't know if you've heard of containerisation.
No, I haven't.
But containerisation is when infants spend a long period of time in contained devices. So it could be car seats, buggies, high chairs, swinging chairs, various different things. And so these infants, up to 3 years old, we see this happening, that they could be in these restrained devices, unable to get out and move around and stretch for quite a long period of time, especially when we think about younger infants, sort of under 1, where you'll see buggies that can come out of car seats and hook onto prams. They can then hook onto the shopping trolley, then they can hook onto a swing chair, which, being a parent, makes your life really easy. But actually, the easy way isn't always the best way. And what's happening is that these children are not developing in a snowflake orderly way. So their muscles are becoming very misaligned. So you'll see lots of curvature of the shoulders because they haven't been able to stretch out. If we go back to sort of 70s and 80s, where we had big prams that were flat, children could kick out their legs. That was perfect for them, and there was lots of time where they could move around and stretch out. So children need to have that opportunity.
And it's really interesting to think about how that changed in society and why that came about. I guess those bigger prams that are, like you say, really flat, they just are not compatible with cars. And that's the thing, isn't it? It's about the compatibility and the size of the kind of the newer, I guess, more modern pushchairs, where you can just lift children into the car. And it is essentially a car seat in a way, isn't it?
And safety as well. Safety is there. We now have these mechanisms in the cars where babies can be safe, which is fabulous. But perhaps sometimes we need to think about maybe breaking up that time that the child is restrained and having more time to lay down, on the floor, both inside and outside, to stretch and roll and explore. Because that's subsequently going to impact on the snowflake development within their muscles. So we need to make sure that happens.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess things like putting resources just slightly out of children's reach, out of babies' reach, in order to be able to encourage them to reach forwards and kind of wriggle on their tummies and things like that. And tummy time, that's quite vital, isn't it? And I think it's something that is not really talked about enough, perhaps. I'm not sure about if it's talked enough with parents when, you know, they have their support kind of networks and groups, and if they do have much support in terms of you know, becoming a new parent. But even in I know that you're a lecturer as well, aren't you? So in terms of academia and courses that we have for students around children's development and physical development and babies, there isn't enough around that early development, and tummy time is something that isn't really focused on. But then that's just one example. There's so much more physical development that isn't really honed in on, in terms of the education of both parents and our future practitioners.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. And in fact, it's across the board when it comes to PE as well. I also lecture in primary PE and early childhood PE, and we get one day with our students. These are initial teacher training students.
Wow.
So one day for that subject area. There's a big push on, you know, really focusing on whether PE should be a core area rather than a foundation subject to become a core subject. But it is the same for early childhood, PD. It's just not given the value that it needs and the recognition it needs. It's often something that's an afterthought. I was delivering training on Monday, and I was speaking to, I had 52 educators, and we were talking about, you know, where do you feel that there's a deficit within your training provision? And they did say that it was physical development, because that they all understand the importance of phonics, they all understand the importance of emotional well-being. Yet PD, they don't feel like they have enough professional understanding in that subject area. But also they did say, a lot of them said that their senior leadership team don't ask for that. So that's not something that they tend to push, because that's not something where they want to necessarily see the data. They'd rather see the data on phonics. So perhaps we need to be thinking about something along those lines, where we can have some level of accountability on children's physical activity levels in early childhood.
Just quickly, I wanted to thank all the listeners for tuning into the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. Those of you who are regular listeners will know that a new episode comes out every Monday morning, ready for your commute, morning coffee, or that reflective start to the week to get you thinking and in the zone. If you haven't already done so, it would really help this podcast to keep going if you subscribe to the channel that you're listening on. The Voice of Early Childhood podcast can be found on 19 different podcast platforms and on YouTube. So it's highly likely that you, your friends, and colleagues can find it on your favorite streaming platform. So please do hit the subscribe button, and this will help us to keep putting out thought-provoking, reflective, and insightful episodes with a wide range of guests. Thank you. I'll let you get back to the episode now. Yeah, that's a really interesting point, actually. I know that recently data has been a big topic, and certainly in terms of on the Voice of Early Childhood, we've been focusing on that. And there's a few podcasts and articles around children's data or collecting data in early childhood. And there's certainly data that we collect around children's kind of understanding of phonics, and maths is always kind of a focus area, isn't it? Then there's the kind of well-being and involvement scales. But in terms of physical development, there isn't really anything early childhood based out there, is there, that is commonly used, apart from obviously the EYFS profile?
Yeah, there are a few things. There's a physical literacy framework that was developed by Youth Sport Trust and Lala Manners a few years ago. There's the Iram Siraj movement scale framework, which was produced, but none of them are widely known.
No.
That's the issue, that there needs to be something that's comprehensive, that everybody can access, and that there's some level of accountability with that. One of my other roles is that I co-chair the Early Childhood Stakeholders Group for that's a national group, alongside Chris Wright from Youth Support Trust, and we're a group of academics and stakeholders, both from Action from Children, Early Years Hubs, Preschool Learning Alliance, various other National Day Nursery Association. We all come together trying to look at, what are the issues surrounding early childhood physical activity and physical development, and how can we best support educators and parents moving forwards and have one clear voice within that. So hopefully over time things will start to change and that voice will become louder, and we can bring about change within the education system.
Yeah, that is so vital. And in terms of the data that is collected, I guess it is about giving physical development more of that kind of status and importance, because so much is always needing to be backed up by data in order to be able to kind of be given that credibility that it deserves, unfortunately. But for those educators specifically that may be quite kind of, I guess, against data, what would you say in terms of the use of recording children's physical development?
I think you have to know your children. There isn't any early childhood educator that doesn't believe that. You have to know your children. In order to do that, you have to observe them. So you have to observe them in play. You have to build a reciprocal relationship with them. And if you are doing that, then that assessment is not going to be getting them to line up and one at a time and stand on a box and jump off. You should be able to do that through perhaps creating a time-lapse study where you go and observe them in free-flow play. You will know whether they're able to jump, whether they're able to balance, whether they're able to take off their shoes and socks independently, put them back on again. You will know if they can self-care. You will know whether they're able to have the focus and attention at being able to stand still, which is an incredibly challenging physical skill for an early childhood child. So all of these things, I think, as an educator, you probably already know if you're observing your children. But to have that in a very simple form, I certainly wouldn't want to make early childhood educators' jobs more difficult. I think making it easy and as simple as possible is probably the best option, but making it as an observation rather than as an assessment tool.
Yeah, it's so important to make sure that observation and that data is useful for the child, rather than just for the kind of assessment's sake and just to have data, as numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and just drawing on that, I've created something called a physical play questionnaire for families, which I'm working with a local authority in Barnsley, and they've issued this family questionnaire, and it's a questionnaire that goes out to parents when you go and visit the children before they start reception. And so it gives you an idea of what kind of level of physical activity these children have. So it asks simple questions like, can the child ride a bike? Can they scoot? Do the parents cycle? Do they go to the park? Can the child swim? Do you have a garden? Do you have stairs in your house? All of these very simple questions will just enable that reception teacher or that educator to be able to plan their environments and their lessons for that first term, which is such a crucial term for these children, in a developmentally appropriate way for the children to make sure that they can access the best provision for them. And it's been such a huge success. And I've also been working on a project with Barnsley again, where we've been securing the prime areas. And obviously my one was physical development. So we had a full day training where I spoke to them about the development of the body and how we can best support children, looking at data, looking at how much physical activity children are expected to have within the recommendations from the CMO and also the WHO. And then on top of that, we had a subsequent meeting 6 months later where It was their time to show what changes they'd brought within their school, adopting a whole school approach, getting families involved, creating portfolios, looking at how the children have exceeded expectations within gross motor movement from the beginning of the time with me, which was the spring term, going through to the summer term. So it was an incredible project, and we'll be doing it again this year. But I think the Nursery World magazine are going to be doing a report on it, which is really exciting.
Yeah, it would be good to kind of see more evidence around that, and like you say, in terms of kind of almost like the before and afters and the effects on everyone involved, like that whole school approach is so vital. And that work is really important. It just does sound like it's more of an intervention, which is a shame, because it should be embedded in the whole school, the whole setting, rather than something that is seen as like a project, like you say.
It was a project, but the plan is to continue through with that. So I think it was about the biggest issue I think we found with the educators is that confidence, because I remember looking back at the Times Education Supplement. They did a survey many years ago, probably about 7 years ago, on educators' involvement with singing nursery rhymes to children. And 75% of educators said they didn't enjoy singing nursery rhymes in front of their kids to children. And I remember thinking at the time, I bet this is really similar to physical activity, because if 75% don't enjoy singing, I would put it at 80% that don't enjoy encouraging movement, because to encourage movement, we have to adapt our environment, and at times we will have to be the ones that are demonstrating and leading.
Modeling,
absolutely modeling. So I was thinking that's such a shame, and so practitioners and educators' confidence, I think, is a really big concern, and I think we need to somehow find ways to support these educators, that you don't need to have been a trained dance teacher or go to the gym every day, that actually if we have some simple principles in place around physical development, we can help children to explore their movement, and also getting families involved with that information, giving them the information around how much physical activity. I mean, so many educators and parents don't know that children aged 2 to 5 should be having a minimum of 3 hours of physical activity every day.
So does that involve things like just going for a walk and playing? It doesn't necessarily mean anything too strenuous that we would see as physical activity as adults.
Yeah, absolutely. If we look at the World Health Organization's definition, it means whole body energy expenditure. So when the whole body is moving at once. So it could be walking, it could be jumping, it could be running, it could be climbing. It could be getting up and down. But it doesn't seem that difficult to manage, does it, to find 3 hours when you look at it like that?
Yeah, and we would hope that children get those 3 hours and more just through doing day-to-day things. But I guess perhaps that's where that, data comes in order to be able to really understand if children are getting enough. Then we need to be able to have the observation and recording of what they do from day to day, both at home and in the setting, to understand where support is needed and if it is needed in a more targeted way. Yeah,
absolutely. And I've just been reading actually a report this morning. It's called the Broken Plate Report. It's part of the a Marmot review with Sir Michael Marmot. And it said that children starting reception, the obesity has risen by 50% in the last year.
Oh, wow. Just in the last year?
50% obesity, 50% in the last year for reception children. And I just thought, my goodness, how can that be so vast? Why is it 50%? That's shocking. And in 2018, the British Heart Foundation did a study, the research centre there, and they said that 2 to 4 year olds, 91% of 2 to 4 year olds were not reaching recommended levels of physical activity. And then we had COVID. And now again, we've got this 50%. So I understand that obviously nutrition plays a huge part in that as well, but that should be something that most of the settings that I visit, nutrition is spot on. and lots of schools are supporting nutrition at home. So I wonder how much of that physical development, is a response to poor, low physical inactivity levels.
Yeah. It's interesting to consider the amount of physical development children get at home as opposed to the amount they get at school and in the setting, and to really understand those differences. And like you say, a lot of the time, perhaps nutrition is supported at home with the work that schools do. But in terms of physical development, that might be a little bit more difficult, because that does require more of that kind of mindset shift. I guess nutrition does as well, but it's probably more so on people's minds than physical development, because physical development is just kind of being physically active is just something that we do, but I think we almost take it for granted.
Yeah, certainly in the world of digital technology that we have these days, like we can have prams with slots for the iPad so that the babies and infants can swipe and all of these things. And actually, I understand that there's the future is AI, digital technology, whether we like it or not. That is the future. But we still need to make sure that we're making time to be out and explore this beautiful planet that we're on, and explore nature and learn to swim, cycle, run, jump, climb, etc.
And there's certainly ways of using technology for the benefit of physical development. There are so many new impressive technologies out there that can actually encourage more physical activity. It's just about using it in the right way. And again, like in moderation, like we say with everything.
Yeah. I'm actually quite against digital technology when it comes to being active. That's that especially in early childhood, I think that's something that we really do need to separate. I see, go into settings and I see children watching programs on an interactive whiteboard with a number of staffs at the back, letting this virtual character lead the PE lesson. And I'm not so sure about that. I don't think that's a very good way forward.
Because although children are moving and taking part in physical development there, the educator, like you say, he sat at the back, is not modelling, active movement and physical development and that kind of love for being physically active. Like you were saying, it's modelling is so vital, both in, like we started saying at the beginning, both in writing and in being physically active in those gross motor skills. So just that being the simple fact of the educator not taking part is already something that children will kind of internalize, in terms of like the physical development is an activity that we just do, and then it can kind of be switched off and we can go and do something else. And the educator doesn't take part. It's just something that we engage in, and it's not part of day-to-day routine.
Absolutely. It needs to be much more holistic than that. So if the educator doesn't have the confidence to lead their own movement-based philosophy as well as a PE lesson, then I would say use the audio and perhaps turn the screen off, so that you've got the audio if you really need to do that. But we must remember the children are watching them. So if they're watching them and thinking, okay, well, the teacher is copying this person or doesn't want to be involved, then we need to sort of question why that's happening. But certainly going back to that environment, if we have an environment that's cluttered with chairs and tables, then actually we need to be conscious of what does that environment say to the children. Is it a sedentary environment? Is it an environment where every table, every station has a chair? Whereas actually children don't need to be sitting down. They can stand up. So a lot of the fantastic settings that I work with, a group of schools in Birmingham and in London, they don't have any chairs apart from a couple of beanbags and a stool in their reception and nursery area, because it's just not essential. We need to make sure that we're reducing that sedentary time. If the children want to kneel or sit on their bottoms or lay on their tummies, that's absolutely fine. But we certainly need to reduce the chair usage.
And that goes back to the early writing and mark making. You don't necessarily need to be sat down at a desk, at a table, in order to write and draw. So just kind of wrapping it all up and thinking how kind of vast this conversation was in terms of going, from early writing to the gross kind of motor skills and even a bit into nutrition, and then the wider kind of health benefits. It just shows how holistic it really is, that, physical development, early writing, tying everything in, and well-being as well. And that's exactly how it should be. And that's why this conversation kind of went in those tangents, because that is what physical development is all about. So perhaps maybe we can pick up supportive environments for physical development at another time. But I just wanted to say thank you for all of your insights. It's been really interesting hearing the different kind of snippets of information that you brought in as well, in terms of like different reports and research. So that's always really important.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for today. And just before we close, I know there'll be some teachers watching this, some reception teachers saying, but what about the reading framework? The reading framework tells us that we have to sit them at desks to write. And so I would say that, go back to, as an educator, your children. If your child is ready to sit at a desk and write, then absolutely. And if they're not, then please have the mark making on the floor, have paper under the desks so that they can write upside down, strengthen their core muscles and their shoulder girdle before you get them sitting at that table to write.
That's some really important advice there. Thank you, Helen. And listeners can find out more on the Voice of Early Childhood website. Thank you very much.